So next we have Jasmine Epps from our DSGA team. She's going to talk to us today about accessibility made simple. Okay, good afternoon, Jasmine.
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming back after lunch. I know it's pretty hard, especially with a webinar, but today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about web accessibility and how you can use Siteimprove as a tool to better understand it and empower your organization to develop content with accessibility standards and guidelines baked in. So like Yen said, I am Jasmine Epps. I am the testing and support lead here at DSGA. And I actually typically handle a lot of the accessibility audits that our team does for you guys. So, and we use Siteimprove to do those accessibility audits. So it's a great tool, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about it today. But first, we will jump into an introduction into accessibility. Talk about why it's so important, especially in terms of your content. Next, we'll dive into the Siteimprove accessibility module, looking at how to interpret the dashboard, how accessibility affects your score, your overall DCI score, and how to view all of the issues and resolve all the issues on your site. Then we'll get into how to use the accessibility audit that Siteimprove provides to make decisions on those issues. Lastly, we'll talk about how to set priorities to tackle your site issues so that maintaining your site accessibility doesn't seem like such a daunting task. All right, so what is accessibility and why is it so important? Accessibility is about making the world around us easier for everyone to enjoy and participate in. Web accessibility is about applying those principles for making the world more accessible to the internet. So Siteimprove Academy refers to web accessibility as the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent people with disabilities from doing what they need to do online. So every Georgian deserves equal access to their government. And as web content creators, it's important for us to consider and prioritize our audience and remember who all is included in that. So let's look at some numbers to put into perspective how many people are affected by web accessibility. So 15% of the world's population has some sort of disability. That is over 1 billion people at this point. So that makes it one of the largest minority groups in the world. Now, how does that affect our constituents here? 27% of Georgians 18 or older live with a disability. Obviously, that's over a quarter of our population, and that's a large percent of our population to consider when we're creating our content. And of that 25% of Georgians over 18 who are of working age, 35% of them are employed. So that is a significant part of our workforce that can be potentially affected by the lack of accessibility. And Rachel actually touched on this just a minute ago, but a lot of people don't consider necessarily income levels and access to the latest and greatest technologies and internet speeds when they're thinking about developing the content for their site. You know, so web accessibility isn't just great for people with disabilities, it's great for everyone. There are situational barriers that should be considered and web accessibility as well, like I mentioned. You know, we've all seen the expansion of Google Fiber and 5G wireless connectivity, but as recent as 2018, about almost 20% of people were still on 3G connectivity. So these are folks that are typically out in rural or developing areas, which we have a lot of here in Georgia. Well, considering that not everyone who views your website will be on the latest and greatest network speeds is a situational barrier to take into account. I think it's also safe to assume, like Rachel mentioned at this point, and even though we have plenty of data to support it, that most people will be viewing your site from a mobile device. Now, when you factor in that the average cost of a user's device is less than $200, web accessibility becomes even more important to make sure that we're serving our constituents who may not have large, high-resolution monitors or, you know, even the devices with the best audio projections. So making sure your content is suited for them as well is extremely important. And lastly, this is a situational barrier that I hope we all find ourselves in one day. Our aging population is one of the fastest growing in the country. And by 2030, at least 20% of the US population will be over the age of 65. And with aging, Naturally come certain ailments like poor hearing and vision, as well as some cognitive barriers, especially as technology advances. So web accessibility is vital to building your site for the future and to serving all Georgians. So what does accessibility address specifically? Well, it aims to solve the issues experienced on the web by those with blindness and low vision, deafness and hearing loss, learning disabilities, cognitive limitations, limited movement, speech disabilities, photosensitivity, or a combination of any of these. The solutions apply to content and technologies on your site, including text and its formatting, images and multimedia like video and audio files, and interaction with forms and the documents on your site. Many people with these disabilities use assistive technologies like screen readers and dictation as well. So making sure that your website can interact with these assistive technologies is key. Okay, so now that we know what web accessibility is and who it affects, now we can get into how it's implemented and enforced. So you've heard this mentioned several times today, the WCAG 2.0 Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and we here at Digital Services Georgia adhere to the 2.0 version of those guidelines. It covers a wide range of recommendations for making your web content more accessible. Following these guidelines will make content accessible for a wider range of people with disabilities and help ease some of the situational barriers our constituents face. So just a little bit of history about the guidelines. Section 508 of the American Disabilities Act refers to these guidelines as a standard to address accessibility, specifically in technology. 508 compliance is actually required for federal websites, but here in the state of Georgia, we require all state websites to be Section 8 compliant as well. And again, like I mentioned, GovHub meets WCAG 2.0 standards. So the web content accessibility guidelines are comprised of 4 overarching principles. Each principle addresses a particular aspect of your content to help you determine if it meets those guidelines success criteria, starting with whether or not your content is perceivable. Is the information and are the user interface components presented in a way that your users can easily understand? So that principle is dealing with things like whether or not your images have alternative text, if your video and audio components have alternative text like captions, is your content adaptable, meaning can users clearly see relationships in your content? Does the placement of a data table, for instance, make sense on the page of the other information that's displayed around it? Is your content distinguishable? Is the text or certain important indicating characters large enough for people to distinguish on the screen? So for example, if you're using a asterisk to indicate a required form field, is that character noticeable enough to get the point across? Okay. Next is whether or not your content is operable. Is the user interface, including the navigation, operable by the user? So this is take into account whether or not your site can be operated using just a keyboard. Have you given your user enough time to read or interact with certain components that scroll or change automatically on the screen, like image rotators, which we no longer use because they have poor usability, but that's just an example. Does your content consider the use of flashing colors or videos or flashing light that could affect people who suffer from seizures? And is your content navigable as you use the keyboard to interact with the site? Is the focus on page elements clearly visible? Are there page titles and proper use of headings and labels? All these things are important to informing the structure and importance of the content, which is really important for people who use screen readers, like we mentioned before. Then you have understandability, similar to perceivability, but less about presentation. This principle just really addresses, is the information itself easily interpreted by the user? Like Rachel mentioned again, keep it simple. Don't make it hard for users to have to understand what it is that they're reading. So is it readable? Does it meet that middle school reading level requirement where applicable? And I say that because by nature, some agencies, the content of their sites are going to be on a higher reading level, like med board or DPH. Like they're talking about a lot of medical things, and by nature that content may be on a higher reading level. Is the content predictable? Would a user be able to easily understand the information that is presented? So try not to include like non-intuitive actions to things that users have grown accustomed to doing online, like completing a form. Simple is better. And does your content provide input assistance, like providing error indicators? Does the interface inform a user if there has been an error when submitting the form, or that there is required input missing? And lastly, is your content robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide range of agents, including assistive technologies? So this principle really just addresses how compatible your code is and how well it's structured. Does it use the best practices? And so that way you can be certain that most assistive technologies will have no issue interacting with your site. So those are the main principles, and they can be overwhelming when consumed in their entirety. So there are many success criteria to address dozens of issues that may occur on your site under each of those principles. But not all websites, not all technologies necessarily need the same level of accessibility. So in order to meet the needs of different groups in different situations, the success criteria for each guideline has 3 levels of conformance: A, single A being the lowest, double A, and then triple A being the highest. So level A tasks could relate to things like the ease of website navigation and readability. Double A could contain tasks that are more specific, such as color contrast ratios, whether or not the text against a certain color background is easily distinguished by people with poor vision or color blindness. And AAA conformance checks for more advanced things like sign language and extended audio descriptions for pre-recorded video and audio content. And because those AAA issues are a little harder to fix, we don't require the content that you produce to fit in that conformance level. So why is all of this important? Well, having accessible content can allow you to mitigate potential financial risks from something as seemingly innocuous as certain users not being able to complete transactions online, which could save the agency's operational costs, or to a more harmful scenario like being sued by a constituent because they don't have the same access to the services that they're entitled to. So the human impact can also be pretty significant. You're able to include Georgians with disabilities in your workforce, which could give your organization the perspective of the individuals who stand to gain the most from your efforts in maintaining your site's accessibility. The standard that we have for all state websites is another reason why it's important, just adhering to those standards, that your site be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. And it's just simply the right thing to do. Again, not only individuals with disabilities stand to gain from the accessibility on your website, but everyone does. All right, so what can you learn? We'll dive now into the accessibility part of the Siteimprove module. So once you view the main DCI dashboard, you can see here that your accessibility score does contribute to your overall score. You can also get a full breakdown of your DCI score by filtering just to the accessibility portion of it. And you can see, export a breakdown of what issues are really driving down your score. Now, speaking of your score, what is it comprised of? Your accessibility score is a measure of how well your site performs against the automated checks that Siteimprove does. So it checks for errors, which are automatic determinations of failures to meet success criteria based on WCAG 2.0. Those are weighted pretty high. Those are errors that were flagged automatically and that you can check out and fix on your site. So they have a pretty high weight. And fixing those issues that are listed as errors will yield you a higher point gain. Warnings are automatically determine failures to meet best practices. So these things should be investigated manually. And for that reason, they weigh pretty low on your score. It's an automatic check to check these particular aspects of your site are not meeting best practices, but because they need to be investigated, they weigh pretty low on your score. And your score is comprised of the percentage of pages on your site with a low error rate. So meaning the number of pages on your site that have no more than one error or warning. So with these three different categories and the conformance levels that we mentioned before, the A, AA, and AAA, combined, Siteimprove weighs the issues that occur on your website and reflect this using points, which in turn generates your accessibility score. So on the accessibility overview page, you'll find a breakdown of your score, and it displays your progress on resolving all the errors and warnings that have been checked on your site. Siteimprove also provides a little handy key that helps you understand the varying levels of conformance and severity. Siteimprove is great in that way, in that it's constantly educating you on accessibility. If it's a new kind of concept to your team, it can be intimidating, but the part I love most about Siteimprove is that it helps you every step of the way to understand accessibility and the effects that it's having on your content and potentially on your site's viewers. So it's great in that. As you can see in this screenshot, there's a ton of little question marks pretty much by everything. And so as you use this tool and get more familiar with it, creating content with accessibility in the forefront will become more second nature. And again, you can get a full breakdown of your accessibility score broken down by the guideline. You can export this and be able to make decisions that way. The majority of the issues being calculated are site-wide, meaning that the whole site needs to be free of that particular issue in order to gain all of the points for it. All right, so now viewing all of the issues on your site, they'll start off by being grouped together by conformance level. You might have a few, but it can be kind of a task to figure out where to start first. Siteimprove does a great job of separating the tasks by different roles: editor, developer, and webmaster. This can be a useful tool for understanding which guidelines can be handled by a particular member of your organization. But since you're on our GovHub platform and we're your partners, we don't expect you to handle developer or webmaster issues. So your dashboard will be automatically filtered to only show you issues that can be handled by an editor. You can also filter by conformance level. You can see all the issues at all levels, but again, you can ignore the AAA issues for now, since that is not a requirement for our platform to meet that conformance level. And you can look at your issues by severity, so errors, warnings, and reviews are introduced here as well. Reviews are potential failures to meet best practices or the success criteria. Your accessibility score does not include issues that are listed as reviews. So reviews, again, do not go against your score. All right, so diving into a specific issue, you'll see there's a description of the issue as well as how to fix it, the level of severity, and the specific guideline that is being violated. You can view the number of occurrences over time, which serves as a way to track your progress on fixing a particular issue. The issue breakdown also shows you each page the issue occurs on. So in this case of reviews, you'll get a list of pages that you need to manually check for the accessibility. So these issues listed here are examples of reviews. All right, and then clicking on a single page, it'll give you details about all the occurrences of that issue on that page. So now that you've taken a look at the issues on your page and you're like, whoa, this is a lot, how can I start to take action on some of these issues? So there is what's called decisions in Siteimprove, and decisions allow users to manage the issues found by Siteimprove that they're not going to particularly address at that time. So this will typically be for one of two reasons. The user has basically said that the issue is not a critical issue in this case, meaning that we can kind of ignore it, or it's not an issue that really needs to be addressed, or the user has just made a conscious decision not to fix the issue. And so just to back up a little bit, each issue has a set impact on your site, regardless of the number of occurrences. So handling an issue on the page entirely and not single occurrences is what you would aim for. And the two decisions that can be applied are can't fix and approve. Approve can only be applied to reviews, again, issues that are listed as reviews, because those require some manual inspection. So you can look at those and say, okay, I've fixed this and it's no longer an issue, and we approve it. Or can't fix. And again, you've made a conscious decision not to fix this. And this can be applied to all types of issues, not just reviews. You can also include a note on why you decided that you're not going to fix that issue. Okay. So how does a decision have an impact on my score? You can gain points when your decision clears the issue from your site. You can do this by just going to your site and fixing that particular issue and then coming back to Siteimprove and rechecking. Or you can just assign the can't fix decision on that issue site-wide on all remaining occurrences on that page. So let's put this into practice a little bit. I've taken a look at some of my issues and I've identified a single late conformance level issue to tackle. This will give me the highest point gain, and it seems like something that I can really make an impact on. So I'm going to go with this one where the heading text is missing. And I'm going to take a look at a particular page where that's happening. If you drill down to that page, you'll see Siteimprove tells me exactly where on that page in that highlighted red area that this issue is occurring. So I go over to the page, and sure enough, there is an empty H2 tag at the bottom of my content. Now, this can happen when working with WCAGs. You add some text formatting, and that formatting can get trapped in other parts of your content. And so this happens, and this is an easy, quick fix. So I go to the page and remove that empty H2 tag, and I come back to check and Siteimprove. And if you check the page again, you'll see that that particular adaptable principal issue is no longer there. And you can also check the immediate gain in points for your accessibility score. So we got a little boost for fixing that really simple, quick, and easy issue. All right, so setting priorities. Where should you start? Again, looking at all of those issues can be a little overwhelming, and it's not as clear where you should start. But the great thing is Siteimprove gives you several different ways to view all of your issues. So you can use the guidelines view as a way to prioritize all of your issues. So it's going to help you with identifying low-hanging fruit. You know, what are some quick wins that we can get? Like I mentioned before in the use case, we identified a single lay issue. Those yield the highest point values and are typically the more easier of the issues to resolve. You can also make a case for more focus on accessibility within your organization by identifying the number of AA issues that may need to be resolved and how they're affecting your score. You can also, here again, filter by conformance level, so you can easily identify those different issues by how they're affecting your site. You can also use the pages view and the PDF view to prioritize. So this is helpful for managing the issues based on the level of importance of the content that it's affecting. So you can see all of the pages and the number of issues that they're affected by. You can look at things like the page views to determine the level of importance, if it's hard to just kind of eyeball and look at the page to make that assessment that way. So there's different pieces of analytical criteria here that you can use to make some of those decisions. And PDFs, because they also require some manual intervention to check, do not affect your score. So again, you can look at all the PDFs on your site, and best practices would be to take that content out of the PDF and put it into one of the structured content types that we have on the platform. But if you have PDFs, you can look at them here and see which ones are most important to your users and be able to make some decisions about improving the accessibility of those PDFs. So how can you improve your score? And the takeaway from that, you can gain the most accessibility points by prioritizing your single A errors, based on your expertise and time. So if you have individuals on your team that have the time to kind of tackle some of those issues, you can divvy them up by tackling the single A issues first and then the double A issues. You can check the total amount of points that can be gained from an issue. So that's a cool way to gain some buy-in into tackling these issues. Whoever can get the most points, you can kind of make it into a game, but checking to see where there can be the most gain is a great way to prioritize tackling those issues. And like I mentioned before, it's best to focus on resolving issues on a whole page rather than just a single occurrence of an issue. So definitely using that pages view would be a great way to affect your score. All right, so what's next? How can Siteimprove drive your content strategy, right? So it can help empower your team with the knowledge to make informed decisions about their content. So again, being active in Siteimprove and using this part of the module will get you more acclimated and more comfortable with thinking about accessibility while you're developing your content. And also, by being able to view an audit of your site, you can provide your organization with clear objectives, with a clear path to improving your accessibility score. And lastly, you can easily create an actionable plan from the information that is provided in Siteimprove as far as your accessibility score. So that makes it easier for you to gain organizational and leadership support. All right, so some of the main takeaways I'd like for you guys to have today is making your content accessible benefits everyone. It's not just for people with disabilities. It is basically making your website more usable and more adaptable to what's to come in the future. A lot of people have Alexas and Google Homes and things like that. Making your website accessible allows it to be interpreted by those types of devices as well. So it benefits everyone, and making your content accessible is just the right thing to do. Improve and then maintain your site accessibility score by resolving issues in Siteimprove. So as you fix issues and you see your score rise, it can be the driving force for your team to create content so that accessibility is baked in rather than being an afterthought in the process. And lastly, let's not forget our responsibility to all of our constituents. We, as content creators and service providers, we owe it to all of our constituents to make sure that we are considering their needs and their barriers as we develop this content in our websites. And let that be the driving force for everything that you do on your website. Really, it's just, this website is not just for us and our personal enjoyment. It's not just for our organization and their uses. It's for our constituents. And that's a great thing to keep in the forefront. So that is it for me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. I have a number of questions for you, or what we can get to. So our first question is, how can I make fixing our site's accessibility issues seem less daunting of a task? There's a lot to do.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think, like, even someone like me who's been working with accessibility for like the last 5 years, it still can seem overwhelming because there's a lot of principles and guidelines to remember. But to make it seem less daunting, like I mentioned, turning it into a game where you can see who amongst the team can fix the most amount of issues and gain the most amount of points. That's a fun way. I know that GTA does a lot of games and stuff like that to keep us engaged. So, and that seems to work. Also, coming up with a actionable plan that kind of divvies up some of the tasks by level of importance to your organization. So whether that be level of importance of the page that it's affecting, or making sure that you meet the success criteria that is appropriate for your audience, prioritizing it that way can make it seem a lot less daunting.
Great. So with that, do you have a recommendation of how often you should review those issues and make decisions?
Yeah, so once you've cleared all the issues that you could possibly clear from your site. As you move forward in developing content, I guess it just depends on the frequency of how often you put out new content. So if you're an organization that puts out a lot of press releases like weekly, I would do maybe a monthly check of accessibility. But if you're someone who only updates the site like once or twice a year, I think maybe a biannual check would be fine. But it really just depends on how often you're adding new content, because we're going to handle all the behind the scenes accessibility issues, the code and making sure that part is ready. But since we don't produce your content, that is something that's going to be something that you'll have to constantly check. So it really just depends on how often you're producing content.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine.
Thank you.